Hello, welcome to CIBER Focus, your source for international business information. I'm your host, Christopher Rice, and our guest today is Dr. Scott Shackelford. Dr. Shackelford serves as a professor of business law and ethics here at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business. He is also the cybersecurity program chair and director of the cybersecurity and internet governance program at the Ostrom Workshop. Dr. Shackelford is an affiliated scholar at both Harvard and Stanford, as well as a senior fellow at Indiana University's Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, and a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Shackelford received his PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge and JD from Stanford University. His areas of expertise include cybersecurity, privacy, property rights, sustainability, and international law and relations. He has published over 100 works and received numerous academic and teaching awards. Today, Dr. Shackelford will share his insights on international online privacy perspectives and the laws that govern data collection and protection. Scott, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
It's a pleasure. No, thank you for having me and for that wonderful introduction. My goodness.
Of course, of course.
I hope my mom was watching.
I hope so. I hope so. To begin, Scott, can you tell us a little bit about the current global information governance landscape? To what extent would you say online privacy is protected by international or national laws?
Or lack thereof, right, yeah. So we do have a regime in place to govern information flows between borders and to help protect private information. In fact, a lot of people might be surprised to realize that privacy is a recognized human right, international human right. You, me, we all have a right to privacy under the UN Declaration on Human Rights and something called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The problem is enforcing those rights and operationalizing those rights, translating them domestically. And that's where we have a lot of experimentation going on around the world. So here in the U.S., we have a really sector-specific approach to both privacy and security. So not all private data is created equal in this country. It matters if it's financial data or health data or your Facebook profile, right? Yes. That's not the case, for example, in the European Union, which has something called the General Data Protection Regulation coming into force soon, which we can talk more about. Yes. That does treat all private information equally. So that's just a different philosophical starting point.
Okay. Great. And so you just mentioned the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, will come into effect in the EU on May 25th, and will have significant implications on how companies treat private data, such as personally identifiable information. What are the data governance requirements under this law and the consequences for mishandling of data?
They're incredibly robust, particularly the consequences. So companies that don't live up to these really strict requirements could be on the hook for up to 4% of their global revenue.
Wow.
So if you're Facebook, for example, you could be talking in the billions. So that's why during the testimony that Mark Zuckerberg gave before Congress, they made sure to pay a lot of attention to the GDPR. In fact, he came out in testimony and said they will be complying with GDPR, not just for their hundreds of millions of EU customers, but globally for all 2.2 billion Facebook customers. Already there's been some talk of that being walked back. We'll see. But it's a big deal because this is a really strong regime that they're setting up. So it includes things like the right of data portability. You can take your data with you when you change services. The right to be forgotten. This is codified. It's written into the General Data Protection Regulation. So if something's inaccurate, if you want to correct it, or if it's just not relevant anymore because it happened 20 years ago, you can get it taken down, right? As well as a 72-hour data breach notification requirement. So, for example, right now, I remember the Equifax breach in 2017. This was a big deal at the time. In the state of Georgia, where Equifax is based, they don't have a timeline for when they have to notify customers after a data breach. Now, 72 hours is going to be the new norm, and we already see more and more companies going in that direction. So it's a big deal for European companies, but it's also a big deal here in the U.S. because any business that's a global business in any way, shape, or form does business in the EU and has to comply with it.
Of course. Do you anticipate that Facebook will face GDPR-related consequences due to its mismanagement of the Cambridge Analytica data incident? And do you think it will face consequences under current U.S. laws?
Potentially, yes, right? So in the U.S. first, they're actually under a 2011 Federal Trade Commission settlement order already. So there's an investigation going on right now, a public one, and it's very rare for the FTC to say that publicly that we're investigating this company, right? But they're looking to see if they violated that 2011 settlement order now. If so, they could be on the hook for up to $40,000 a day of violation since then. So that could add up. There's also a number of state-level investigations going on. Different attorneys general from Massachusetts, from New York are getting involved in this. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens at the end of the day. In the EU, the short answer is yes. It's going to be interesting to see how enforcement for the GDPR plays out, because this is going to be impacting so many companies, even universities that have branches in the European Union, right? Including IU are interested in GDPR. But if you're Facebook, you have to realize that you're coming into this with a big target on your forehead, right? I don't think it's it's common knowledge basically that companies like Facebook are not very popular in terms of EU regulators. Same with Google, same with Amazon, right? So that's why they have to make sure that they're doing a good job and living up to not just the letter, but the spirit of the GDPR. So we'll see if that plays out or not.
Okay. Well, given our current security climate, would you say governments or corporations have a larger onus to enhance universal information governance standards?
I think it's on all of us at the end of the day, frankly. Yeah. I mean, I write about this concept called cyber peace a lot, right? Which is, what's the best we can hope for in terms of peace on the internet? And then, how do we get there? And the how do we get there part really means we all need to have a stake in this, right? So that means individuals, us, asserting our human rights to privacy, right? So pushing our policymakers, pushing our representatives to recognize that. Governments clearly have a role to play. There's been a lot of reform efforts after the Zuckerberg testimony. Something called the Consent Act came out. And this would, for example, force these social networking companies to comply more explicitly with, not, as we said, not only the letter, but the spirit of some of the existing U.S. sector-specific laws. It would give the Federal Trade Commission, for example, a lot more authority to place bigger fines on companies that don't live up to what they say they're doing with our data. And ultimately, there's been some discussion already of, this is called, our data is what is making these valuations of firms like Facebook incredibly high. So, hey, why don't we start paying us for that data, right? And there's been some startups that have already been trying that, but that kind of flips the script in an interesting way. I wouldn't be holding my breath for Facebook to start that anytime soon, but some smaller social networks could, and they could start to maybe bleed away customers as a result of that. But ultimately, I think, for example, GDPR is a good thing because it's forcing this conversation. It's showing that other regimes, other areas of the world, other countries that we share a lot in common with are striking this balance in a different way. And that makes us think about these same issues, I think, in a new and positive light.
Scott, if you had to forecast 5 years from now, what would you say the data protection landscape would look like?
It's a great question, yeah. If you would have asked me this 5 years ago, when the last time I did one of these, right around 2013, if we'd be talking about this in relation to the stakes that we are now, I think I would have laughed. But no, I mean, privacy, security, these are incredibly interrelated concepts at this point. You can't have privacy without security. So when we talk about global information governance, we are seeing some trend lines converge around the world. So we did a survey a year ago and found that a couple dozen nations are now all approaching cybersecurity, how we protect our critical infrastructure, how we protect our privacy in similar ways by using this bottoms-up approach to risk management, basically a framework approach that was pioneered here in the U.S. but has been going around the world. So in other words, we're starting to see some convergence. We're using the same vocabulary, the same risk management vocabulary to deal with privacy and security issues. That wasn't the case even a few years ago. So there's some positive developments there, right? But there's also certainly a heck of a long way to go. It'll be interesting to see if this GDPR regime, which has a big extraterritorial reach already, starts to bleed out into other related partner jurisdictions.
Global norm of such.
Exactly, whether we could lead to a norms, more of a movement to norms here. And we've seen, thankfully, a lot of progress in that. And the Obama administration deserves a lot of credit. From 2014 with an agreement with China, they had a code of conduct around intellectual property protections. The G7, the G20, the UN group of government experts kind of put together various lists of cyber norms that have been signed on to. That process came to a screeching halt in 2017. But you know what? A lot of us are facing common problems, so my hope is that conversation will get restarted. And that's actually the point of a project we're doing right now with Microsoft. We're looking across 55 countries, plus the EU, across 7 different policy areas, including privacy, to see how all these countries are regulating common problems in the hopes of jumpstarting those conversations again about what norms could look like.
Great. Yeah. Scott, thanks so much for coming in today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
And cyber peace.
That's all for this edition of CIBER Focus. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's CIBER, cyber, @indiana.edu.